There we go. We're recording. So welcome to Wild Exchange this Friday. Keaton and Andy, two graduate students here at Linfield, are in the Master's of Science in Business, and they can tell you a little bit more about their program. I don't know. It's exciting. I just don't know exactly where they are in the details of it. But I will turn it over to them to get us started today.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, so we are currently in the master's program and we're working on our fellowship for that. And as part of that, we are kind of taking over WildX and playing a bigger part in that. And so this week we are hosting a conversation on current events happening in Newberg. And we wanted to address this topic because it's very current right now and it's been making the news. And we feel that it could be one of those issues that gets a lot of attention right now, but could fade away. And so we wanted to have a conversation while it still has that attention and get some thoughts and open dialogue around that.
Yeah, so I guess a little bit of introduction for myself. For those of you who don't know, Andy and I are in different tracks within the master's program. So we take all the same classes for the first 2 sessions, and then we split off into, I'm doing design and innovation, Andy's doing sports leadership. And so that's kind of where we are with that program. But to piggyback off what Andy said, it seemed like obviously Newberg, our neighboring town. And for me, I work at a vineyard up in the hills of Newberg, and I've had people come in from like California, Texas, and the first question they ask is, what's going on with the school board? Like, what's going on? And so at first I didn't know about it. And then I started doing some research, and then Andy and I felt like it was a pretty good topic to have a community conversation about. So what we really wanted to do was just come with a timeline and kind of the facts that have gone on. And then after that, open it up to conversation about what might be best for them to do next. And also kind of how school boards have become this hotbed for political debate around the country. So as far as timeline goes, so really it got into the news heavily over the last month or so, but the process started back in May 2021. So that's when 2 new board members were elected to the council. And both of these board members were supported by the conservative political action group, Save Our Schools. And so with those board members being introduced, of the 7, 4 of them were on the conservative side. And then the board immediately sent a couple different actions into effect, overhauling an all students belong policy, which is a policy among other things that included banning signs such as swastikas, Confederate flags. That banned them, and they essentially looked at that policy and rewrote it, a policy that had been enacted by the old board. And then they also began looking at the district's stance on anti-racism instead of some of the race theory that was taught in classes, and trying to reverse that as well. And throughout that process, they came up with, the board themselves and a group of parents claimed that where was the quote? So they don't agree with the gender ideology that the flag pushes, referring to the pride flag. And so they started this movement to try to ban, essentially in their words, any symbols of political, quasi-political, or controversial flags. And so that started in the beginning of summer. And then in August, the board officially voted 4-3 to ban any political symbols, including BLM and pride flags. And the official statement was no symbols of political, quasi-political, or controversial flags. And then a week later, the board hired, without public approval, an attorney to essentially write the language that was going to be behind the ban and provide counsel to the board members that voted yes. And so they're being investigated for that because they did not confer with the public before doing that. And then in the middle of September, news broke that a Newberg student was involved in a slave trade Snapchat group which consisted of students sending pictures of Black students at the school and pretending to auction them off. And so he's still under investigation. And then a week later, an elementary staff member was fired for showing up in blackface at her hearing with the school board. She claimed that she was dressing as Rosa Parks to signify herself standing up against the vaccination requirement that was put on staff members. And so that's kind of what's gone on in the last month. Currently, within the last week or so, there's been a movement to recall the board president, Brian Shannon, who is the main advocate for this ban. And they're still waiting for final papers on that recall before collecting signatures and then going to a vote on the ballot. And so just a little additional information on it. So the school board, like mentioned earlier, is under investigation for hiring a lawyer without public notice. The superintendent of the school district has advised the board and the public that the ban is actually illegal under Oregon law. And so if the school board were to go through with that vote, he would not support it because it is illegal under Oregon law and he can't put that into effect. Teachers have issued a statement saying that they will file a lawsuit against the board if the ban is pushed through. And the city council and state legislators have spoken out against the ban, stating that it is illegal under Oregon law. So Newberg, there's been a couple different movements within Newberg, some for and some against, in terms of parades and protests. One quote that I pulled from one of the articles I was reading from a Newberg student quoted that, "My life matters, I am safe here, and my teachers care about me." And that's what she responded to a question asked about what those flags meant to her. And so all this information was derived from a couple different articles, a Coin 6 article, Pamplin Media, and an Oregon Live article. So obviously still a very debated issue within Newberg, but we just kind of wanted to open it up to what you guys think could be some actions from here, what your thoughts are in general about it, and how it kind of is providing like this little microcosm of what seems to be something that's happening all over the country. I know it's happening in my hometown, that school boards have become this like hotbed for different political debates when they're really supposed to be a nonpartisan group. So
I just want to really applaud you both for taking on this topic, because it's definitely been something that I've been following and seeing in the news, and I think what we're doing right now is just a good first step, because I think when a lot of these things happen, they become so polarizing that we refuse to kind of talk about it, or we're just like, oh yeah, it's crazy what's going on in Newberg, right? And we kind of just like kind of laugh it off, but it's like, yeah, how can we really unpack this and think about kind of the legal pieces, the community aspects? You have parents, you have students, and teachers, and like different groups that are kind of all involved, and just trying to kind of make sense of all of it. And I'm still like, I think it just makes my head spin a little bit to think about like, okay, so you had the school board, and then, you know, the legal pieces of that, and then also I was really interested in kind of hearing what the students had to say from their perspective. And it kind of seems to be a theme that I've been seeing in kind of these school board debates where, you know, parents are, you know, obviously wanting to speak up for their student, for their kids. But I also just wonder what kind of, how much that's impacting the students and kind of their mental health and well-being. I know I saw at one of the football games recently, there was a lot of both student sections that had kind of pride flags and BLM flags out. So yeah, and then I also, when we talk about the media piece, I always just wonder like how much of it gets kind of sensationalized and how much of it maybe gets just maybe overblown. I don't know, but yeah, I just wanted to first start off by just applauding you guys for taking this on and help us try to make sense of it, because it's not an easy discussion to have, for sure.
Yeah, and I second that, Natalie, just thinking too about, you know, these are such busy times for everybody, and yet these are core elements of what makes our community tick. How do we establish some common ground within our community so that our schools feel safe? Our schools feel safe from the student perspective. People feel seen and heard and appreciated as students, but also within the generations that generally are on school boards or in the leadership, where those of us in administration are older than students. We have different perspectives. We've grown up in different cultures, and how can we do our job to best protect students without putting constrictions on students that are just coming from our own filter, our own upbringing, our own sense of what's right and wrong, without examining those filters. So I think it's important that I congratulate you, along with Natalie, for bringing this conversation to WildX, but also in just not letting this moment in history go by. This is something that is, like, when I read some of this stuff or hear you recap it, Keaton, I'm like, wait, what? You know, like, some of this stuff just is so mind-blowing, and it's so easy to get lost in our day-to-day of like, well, we need to deal with, we got homecoming, we got all these other things going on, that it's easy to just let this slide. And you're right, it probably will fall out of the news cycle pretty quickly. So how do we, as broader, you know, in the broader community of Newberg, and I know we've got a lot of students from Newberg, how do we sort of actively engage in this conversation and appreciate what were the various things that brought us to this point where someone felt like they needed to go to the school in blackface, right? Or felt like they needed to take these actions to ban these flags. What brought us to that point, and how do we engage all community members, particularly students who are younger, who have a different upbringing, a different sense of themselves than I did when I was their age, right? And different generations would. So how do we engage all of those groups to come up with a solution that works for our community? That's generally, that's the big question here. And I'm curious, is anyone from Newberg? Does anyone live in Newberg currently? Nope. Okay.
I do not live in Newberg, but I did want to say Sherwood has not, to the best of my knowledge, had some of the same issues, but this was the most public, the last school board election was the most public, most contentious I have ever seen in more than 20 years of living in Sherwood. So I think some of the same challenges, I guess, are being experienced.
I was also going to ask if anyone was like has been a part of a school board, because I've never been a part of a school board kind of situation. And I wonder if it's always kind of like Jennifer Rich mentioned, like that's been the most public and the most contentious, and like I wonder what's driving that. If there's, you know, the kind of COVID concerns, I know the critical race theory stuff has been kind of a big one too, but I'm just wondering kind of if anyone has any insights on those dynamics.
If I may be so bold as to offer a historical perspective, this is actually, it was interesting listening to Keaton and Andy talk about school boards being non-political. Actually, that is not the case. So after the end of the Civil War, as we began to form these things called school boards, actually there was a lot of information that was put in the history books and textbooks referencing or whitewashing the experience of slavery. And it was an area, particularly as you moved up into the beginning of the 20th century, where women joined school boards. It was one of the opening places where women could actually join and go into politics. And a significant run for school boards was organized by daughters of the American Revolution and others to make sure that their view of history was what was taught in schools. And so this what we see is the reemergence of that trend across the country. And Keaton and Andy, I'm glad you're doing this. And I can tell you the most powerful thing that you can do to help shape this dialogue is that people your age need to register and then vote, and not just vote in presidential elections, but they need to vote at the local elections, because that's where the action is. And so people from the school boards often move into city council positions and then move into mayoral positions and move into congressional. They emerge out of the local elections. So there is a long history of this, and I hope that that what you're looking at is motivating you to be engaged in shaping this dialogue in a constructive way. So thank you.
Does anyone know how? So I have my own image of how a school board people are elected to the school board, but is it the same as any other election? Like you run and you're voted on by the school district, or is it just appointed? Does anyone know the exact process of that?
And the process varies across school districts. However, it is very common for people to run for school boards. There are a lot, when we think about politics, we often think about it at the national and congressional level, but everything from the sheriff's deputy to judges to school boards are actually voted for in local elections, particularly in smaller sized towns, which Oregon has a significant number of.
I know here in McMinnville, I have colleagues that have been on the school board, friends of mine that have run for school board. It's done by ward, and how they define the wards, I'm not necessarily geographical areas, but many of those positions, to be honest, run unopposed. And it's, again, getting people to understand that really significant impact to the community can happen through a school board, and getting folks to not see that as, oh, well, that's something else. That's not necessarily important, but understanding that really, I mean, how you influence young children's minds and their experience and making them feel valued is critical to their success. And that starts at the school board. And so unfortunately, many of them do run unopposed. And I think these should be things that are more thought out. And again, I appreciate what Dr. Davis said about, people don't pay attention as much to the school board elections as they do to the, US Senate elections and the presidential elections. And the decisions that our local school boards are making have as great an impact, and maybe even a greater impact upon what's happening in our local communities and the impact on our children as anything else.
I think that's an interesting point too, where maybe this trend of having school boards be this big place of debate is in a way a good thing, because it does bring attention to the power that these school boards have. Like I think about in my hometown, from the age that I was like aware of what a school board was and who was on it, to this day, it's been the same members. And so when people are disagreeing with things and they want things to change in the community, maybe it's them realizing finally that it is at that level that it needs to change, and that they have the power to do that. Because it is, at least where I grew up, they ran unopposed for however old I am. So.
I was just gonna say, I agree with you, Andy, that or Keaton, sorry, that, and it's almost a good thing, because it's also, I think, showing that how important education is, how important what's being taught in schools and what's kind of happening with young people is. And so it's just kind of scary that there is kind of, like President Davis said, this wanting to control the narrative. And it makes me really sad when people kind of want to say they want to protect their students or protect their kids from knowing the truth, but at the same time it's when we're getting ready to have like Thanksgiving and it's Monday's, a debated holiday too, of like, is it Indigenous Peoples Day, is it Columbus Day, what does that look like? And so I think in a way it is a good thing that there is a little bit of more of this kind of schism and the discussion happening, at least that what is being taught and what we're being taught in schools, and who gets to have that say.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting dynamic at the high school level too, because I feel like that's the age in which some high schoolers start to realize like the voice and the power they have in their own education and own choices, but it's also the age where a lot of parents are still speaking up for either their kid or their own ideals. And so how do you have, like, in one of the articles they were talking about how 2 board members introduced the idea that they should have a council made up of high school students, local community members, local business owners, and teachers to have different policies run past and kind of vetted before the school board votes on them, and the school board shut it down. But there is that idea that it really in high school you're educating the students, and how much say the students have on that education is almost none right now, unless they're like voicing it through their parents or they're able to speak up at a school board hearing. Like, I know that I've only been to one school board meeting in my life, and it was in high school. There was a Title IX bill that was proposed to the school board because not my high school, but the other high school in the town, they had no softball facility, and so they played softball like the middle school, and they were going to build like a dual practice facility for the baseball and softball team. And so I went to see what it was about, and it was essentially all students standing up and talking, and the few parents that did stand up, I don't think it was as well as received as what the students had to say. But it's, yeah, I don't remember exactly what was said at the meeting, but I think that it's an interesting dynamic, because you have, like, I think in the Newberg situation, from what I was reading, it seemed like the students are really trying to create change there, especially with this ban. They feel it directly affects them, but they're kind of turning left and right and trying to look for, like, how can they do that? Like, okay, our school board doesn't support us, so what's the next step? Like, how do we make our voices heard and enact change if the people directly enacting these policies aren't going to help us? So.
Yeah, and it's kind of wild that, like, we're talking about education, but then what kind of sparked a lot of this controversy was over just like symbols and signs, and what, instead of maybe just trying to have a more intensive conversation around what those signs mean and what those signs stand for, just banning them outright just feels a little bit, anytime you ban something, right, it has kind of this kind of just connotation that it's there's going to be, a debate, almost like when you talk about kids and you tell them not to do something, they want to do it even more, right? So it makes me wonder kind of what led to that in the first place. Like, how did that did they talk about the articles much about that? Is like why they even kind of the reasoning for the ban?
Yeah,
they were saying that, I think they were saying it was like political, they were political signs, right?
Yeah, which I think is like really in their nature, I don't think those flags are political, but we've made them political. I feel like we've politicized them. The statement in the article was saying how Brian Shannon, so the president of the school board, and a group of local parents, I didn't say how many, brought up the case that they didn't like the gender ideals that the pride flag was teaching students. And it's interesting to say teaching, because it's not like it was being used in the curriculum, like it was just in the school. But I think like the wording of the ban, political, quasi-political, or controversial, like those are pretty opinionated ideas. I mean, you have one flag could be political to someone and completely not political to someone else. And so who's to say what's political, what's not, what's controversial, what's not? And they've kind of just decided that they're the ones that are going to say what goes and what doesn't. So,
Keaton, can I ask you a question? Because I came here from the great Commonwealth of Virginia, and Virginia used to be, for those of you who don't know, was the heart of the Confederacy. And some people are still fighting the Civil War there. Matter of fact, when I first heard the Civil War referred to here, and they were talking about it, University of Oregon, Oregon State University, I'm like, please don't use that term to me anymore. So how would you and Andy place the display of the Confederate flag at school within the context of the Black Lives Matter or the Gay Pride flags?
yeah, I mean,
It's like, let me get out the popcorn. I'm going to sit here and think about this for a second. I saw that look on your face, Laura. Go ahead.
I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was just talking about, how who's to decide like what's controversial and what's not. Like obviously to a lot of people, especially in the South and in Virginia, the Confederate flag is not controversial or political at all. But you come out here and on the West Coast, it's the complete opposite. And it's the same way with BLM and pride flag. So I think that there's no right answer. But I can see the argument for if you're going to allow BLM and pride flags, then you need to allow Confederate flags. And so it's a tough question. But I think that really what needs to happen is open conversations like this need to happen. I mean, people just don't talk about stuff enough. They read stuff, they read headlines, and they get an idea, and then they live in an echo chamber and they hang out with people who think the same way and tell them what they want to hear. And I feel like the days where you could like have a conversation and disagree, they don't happen anymore, because if you disagree on something, like people just hate each other for it. And so having like real conversations around these issues, and really trying to come from a perspective of understanding why someone thinks that, or why they support this, and why they think this flag means something to them and this flag doesn't mean something to them, needs to happen more often. And I think that's what needs to happen in Newberg, is there needs to be an explanation of kind of the decision making behind it. And
when President Davis asked that question, I immediately thought of, to me, and this is my personal thing, it's like, and I hate to be talking so much, but to me, like the pride flags and the BLM flags, to me, those promote inclusion. Like, let's be inclusive of all people. And like, I'm kind of, Black Lives Matter, just meaning that like for so long, Black Lives Matter hasn't mattered. And whereas the Confederate kind of stands, what it kind of represents to me is kind of exclusion and divide, and like Jane said, being divisive. And one group is, it's really tough though, because it can be interpreted different ways. And just how, like, I mean, because I'm sure for some kids, the pride flag is just a rainbow. Like, they don't even really know what it even means, and that's what's interesting too. And same for the Confederate. I'm sure there's plenty of people who just think the Confederate flag sounds for like Southern pride, because they're just not educated on it, and it's really crazy to think about just how powerful the symbols can be. But I think it is also too, intent matters, like whenever you're dealing with symbols and how you're using them, if you're trying to be inclusive versus exclusive.
Yeah, I have a hard time with like allowing, to fly like a Confederate flag. It just seems weird to me because, I mean, ultimately the root of it, main reason why like the Civil War started was for the rights to have a slave trade. And then along with that, I mean, it was the flag of the Confederate Army, which ended up losing. So why are we even, to me, it's like, why are we even flying a flag that stands for like this one part of the country that lost a war? I don't know. It just seems like there shouldn't be any connection with that anymore.
I think one of the things to understand about ourselves as human beings too is that as human beings, we love narrative and we create signs and symbols for everything. We have signs on our street. We make symbols that have emotional significance out of things like a flag, when really it's a flag, right? So if we can recognize that there's that component, that as human beings, we will always create narrative. And so we will always make these things more important than the materials that put them together. And in that mindset, I think it's going back to your point, Keaton, to have a conversation about that. Like, let's unpack why we're so invested in these symbols and what are we really invested in? And does it have to be in this form of a flag or a pin or a whatever, right? What is the part that we really want to have be seen about ourselves? And get that across, because there's to choose that, this flag is political, but this flag is not. Flags are flags. Like, flags are easily political or not political, depending on what kind of symbolism we project to them. And so getting into the nitty gritty of which flags are appropriate and which are not, in a way, is getting away from the heart of it, which is the fact that we like to form symbols of our values. And let's hear the values.
That just reminds me of like when the whole when the NFL was in the news for kneeling, like everyone got caught up with kneeling, and it's like, it's not about the kneeling, it's the message that behind it. But not no one, but a lot of people didn't take the time to ask that question and to figure out what the reason was for the kneeling. And also, to Nina's point in the chat, there was a lot of conversation in the articles about how the students, when those flags were banned, they felt like the students felt like the teachers and the staff within the school who had certain flags in their classrooms were wearing like pride, like pins, stuff like that, that to them represented a safe space. And so that was a space that they could go to talk to a teacher about a certain issue. Or they felt like they were supported in that area. And so obviously each student's gonna have identified different things with different safe spaces. And so then to take that away, these students were talking about how now it's not as though they feel like the teachers don't want to talk to them anymore, but it was kind of like a way for them to identify where they could feel the most safe. And so it obviously has much more meaning to some people than others. But that's something we have to understand.
Hey, Keaton and Andy, the symbols, does that also include what students are wearing? How you look, your hairstyle, your color of your shirt, what you wear, is that also part of the ban?
My understanding of the ban, not necessarily like hairstyle, and I don't know, I do believe it actually carries over to what you wear, in terms of if you were to wear a shirt with the flag or BLM on it, is not allowed. And so that's another interesting boundary. Like now it's not a dress code, but you're banning the right to expression in school. And if it's not just like flags, so in that case, like, it's not that they don't like the flags, it's they don't like what the flag is standing for, because they're banning just the representation of that ideal in all aspects, like clothing, flags, pins. Yeah.
So Keaton and the other students on this is, first of all, this is a fascinating conversation. This is what I imagine that a university like Linfield will be doing, having these kinds of thoughtful discourses and involving relevant issues of the day. So I want to ask the question a little closer to home, and it goes and it piggybacks on what Mr. Heyer just asked. Should Linfield say what is acceptable for students to wear or not wear or display on campus? And let me give you for instance, should, because people have strong feelings about these things. Should it or should it not be okay for students to wear MAGA gear? Should it or should it not be okay? And I actually heard about this when I came here. I haven't seen it yet, so please, somebody who knows more about this than I do, correct me if I'm wrong. Should they be able to wear this little frog thing, which is supposed to represent a certain ideology? Should people be free to wear all of these various symbols which identify them with particular ideologies that exist behind them? Just tossing it out as a question.
I think no, that's another great question, and I think that it's one of those. You can't pick and choose. Like if you're gonna ban certain flags, then you got to ban all expression of flags. And if you're going to allow certain things, then you got to allow all of it. I think once you start making exceptions is when people feel like it's a bigger controversy. Like in terms of the MAGA, I think that it's less like if you just take it for its base core value, or not value, but principle. It's Trump's campaign slogan, right? But it's really, people have the problem with everything behind that and everything that Trump did. And so it's not necessarily that maybe people disagree with Make America Great Again, but it's what that stands for that pisses people off. And so I think it's, again, having those conversations and making people understand that. And I think Jane made a great point, like by banning these symbols, their significance is increased. Like I think by banning them, people just want to represent it more. They want to show their pride more. They want to wear everything that represents what was banned. And so I think that's a question that could be debated forever. And I think like it's the exceptions. Like I think in any decision, once you start making exceptions, that's when the slippery slope starts. So, but it's also hard to make an all ruling, all this or none of this. And so where the middle ground is, I don't know.
I mean, I think this is the question, like parents, both on the right and the left, in trying to make a judgment about school curriculum or what their children are exposed to. They're trying to foster what they think are their values and promote their own, and they may or may not want their children exposed to other values. So there's so how do you do this? How do you communicate about this when both sides think they're protecting their children? And then I was just saying also, these symbols are a way of evoking our ancient affiliations with tribes, and we're the in group, you're the out group. And isn't that how you're saying, like, we belong, you don't? I don't know.
So Jennifer, and picking up on that point and throwing this back into the public sphere, I'm beginning to feel like Natalie, Dr. Welch felt, where I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'm loving this conversation though. And so the United States is a unique social experiment. It's the only country, so Laura's like, okay, all right, she went into my hair. So it's the only country that I can think of that doesn't have one of the three things that typically constitute a people. there is no one ethnicity that constitutes the United States. There is no one language. The United States, much to a lot of people's surprise, has no official language. In fact, I tell people Thomas Jefferson wanted it to be German because that was the language of science at the time. But he said that people should be able to come here and speak whatever language. So there's no official language. And number three, it doesn't have an official religion. And so it has none of those three things that typically bind the country. The only thing that keeps this country together, to the extent that it is together, is the language in the Declaration of Independence, which starts out, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. It is an ideology. And then that drops down to exactly what you're talking about, Keaton and Andy, which is public education and values. So when we by very definition, even though we don't want to talk about it this way, and it hasn't always been practiced this way, we are a multicultural society, which means that we have different values about different things about what should be taught. And what you're talking about in Newberg is representative of how do we address what should be taught in school from a public perspective. And unfortunately, in this country, we butt up against the me attitude. How does this impact me and does it reflect my values? And I say all that to say is it's a big problem. And I'm just wondering, and just building on what Jennifer said, is, how do you have any thoughts at all? And I realize it's a big question, or any of the students have any thoughts at all about this, but how do you address this notion that we do believe different things, we do think differently? And then what happens when it comes to education? And it goes to the very nature of, here's a simple question. There you go. Thank you for allowing me a space to ask this question. What is the purpose of education? Boom.
I think ultimately it just comes down to giving the next generation the tools to succeed. Like what that looks like, I think changes from time to time, but ultimately it's just preparing the next generation to be successful.
And I'm grabbing stuff from my graduate degree itself, that we need to create environments in which education occurs, in which students feel supported in that learning experience. And so it comes back to the students, Keaton, that you were talking about earlier, that said, I felt like when I saw a pride flag, I felt like that was a place where I could feel safe. And again, part of education is again, moving students from a period of feeling safe to a little bit of discomfort. Learning does stretch us, and it should stretch students. It should present you with things that cause you to think outside of your comfort zone and cause you to think critically about, okay, this is a different perspective that I haven't considered. But I think overall students need to go into a classroom environment or a school environment in which they feel comfortable and feel like there are individuals in that environment that are there to support them. And I think that's what allowing a teacher to wear a pride pin or a BLM, Black Lives Matter shirt or symbol in their classroom allowed them to feel like, okay, here's somebody I can talk to.
But what if I want to make some students feel comfortable by wearing a Confederate flag?
Yeah, and I think what you just said, Jeff, made me think about the idea of like being uncomfortable. And we talk about that in Dr. Madden's class a lot, that like that's where real growth and real learning comes from. And I think that, so this notion of that we have to, I'm not a parent, but our kids, like that we have to protect them from a certain ideal or certain side. When like, I'm sure if I talked to my parents, I'm sure they did that a little bit, but I think their overall philosophy was, we can put him in a situation, but he's going to be exposed to all sorts of different things. And that's part of growing up, and that's part of learning. And I think the more experiences and the more views and the more people from different backgrounds that you meet is part of that education process that is going to make you successful in the future. And it's the idea that, like, when we live in this bubble and we're protected from all, oh, you can't think this, or you don't want to talk to this person, that's when you grow up and you just have this like very tunnel vision of the world. And I think that so exposing, you don't have to expose kids to absolutely everything, but letting them kind of naturally be exposed to different perspectives and different ideologies is good for them in the end, and it lets them choose kind of what they do truly value. I remember reading a story about the son of a KKK Grand Wizard, and he had obviously grown up in that ideology for his entire life, went to school at Syracuse, and everyone knew who he was. And instead of kind of casting him out, this group came to him and was like, hey, we know you hold these ideologies, come and like talk to some of these people that you discriminate against and like learn where they're coming from. And over the course of like 2 years, he became best friends with all of them, completely like disavowed his dad. And so, but he was never exposed to those types of people or those views before. And so that's just like a small example of how once you're exposed to those views or different ideologies, it can change your mind. And I think that's important in education.
Yeah,
I agree with that, Keaton. I think of education in a lot of ways is you can correlate to athletics. You know, when you're younger, you're learning the base fundamentals of the sport. And then as you get older, you start to play with other exceptional athletes. You know, then you got little leagues, then you go to middle school, then you got high school. And then eventually, if you choose to play in college, you play with other all-stars. And then you're exposed to coaches who've been in the game for a period of time. And so you're able to work with people who are better than you, and then you're challenged in different ways to meet expectations in athletics. And then it gets me to think about my own kids with religion. You know, both Teresa and I grew up in religious families, both different religions, but we never forced our kids in a certain religion. You know, they went to church on their own, but their minds changed about religion when they came to Linfield. Being exposed, like you talked about, they took religious studies and got a better understanding of different religions, and then they studied abroad. And into today, their mind is different from when they were younger. So that exposure around the educational piece, the experiences, visiting with different people, different religions, they're able to create their own concepts and beliefs because of that.
Yeah, I also think I was just going to add a story for this kind of reminded me of. I had a student when I was at Tennessee teaching during my PhD who it was a pretty big class, but he would always wear the Chief Wahoo Cleveland Indians hat to class, you know, every class period. And it was, I kind of want, but I was still very new to teaching too at this point. And so I didn't really say anything. And in the class, I think we ended up covering the mascot thing a little bit, but like, I try really hard in those situations too, to not be too overtly like, this is how it should be and blah, blah, blah. But by the end of the course, like he actually reached out to me and we had a long discussion, and we've stayed in touch over the years. And he is like completely changed his whole, he's just like, I just didn't know, like, I just didn't realize what that could mean to somebody. And I think that gets back to the point of like actually getting to know people on an individual one-to-one like basis, and trying to stay away from lumping people into groups and saying like they think this way, so they're bad. You know, one group's bad and one group isn't. So whenever we're able to have those like one-on-one dialogues, and you know, maybe not take offense right away at a certain symbol, but to try to kind of unpack it a little bit more and understand behind it. And so that's been a really powerful learning for me personally. And I totally agree. I was also thinking earlier when we were discussing like just about safe space. It's like, you know, there's another school shooting this week. Like this is like, that's it. It's a whole other kind of issue that needs to be dealt with, and that's safety, right? And this, what we're talking about, I think is a lot deeper than that. It's about being able to feel like you can have conversations like this. And so yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add, going back, Andy, to your point about school being preparing the next generation to be successful, and that part of our obligation as leaders and educators in that, knowing that we are getting older every day, that we examine what success is. That maybe the word isn't success, maybe the word is thrive, to help the next generation thrive, because success in the way that my generation might have defined it might be very different than how your generation would define it. And how has the world changed in such a way that an old definition of success is actually no longer applicable? Somebody might decide that what form of success that they have is that they get to live their true self, which is something that maybe their parents didn't get to do before. And now they have this opportunity. That would be thriving for them. Some people might want to just hit it big and make a bunch of money. And there are certainly parents who are like, hey, the point of school is to get a job and get out of my house. Like, that's a real thing too. But maybe what is success for each person, and what is thriving? If each of us had to define thriving, we'd have 19 different versions of thriving in this call. And I think that's part, as educators, to be open to that, to check our own filters on what we think success is, and let individuals determine what is thriving for themselves.
If I can jump in, one thing that I'd like to say, if I'm reading the room, most of us are opposed to the ban. I don't know how each of us personally believe, but I don't know if you all know, but at least one of the board members is a Linfield alumni. Her name is Ines Peña. When you're in the hot seat, you get attacked a lot. And so I know she's been attacked a lot. One way that we can support those who feel or who express values similar to our own is to send them a note. Keep up the good fight, because she's in it and she's fighting on behalf of students. So if you get a moment to send her an email, to send her a note, I'll put her link in the chat. I think she graduated from here maybe, I want to say 10 years ago, but she's one who's walking the talk right now. She's one of the youngest board members that was elected, and she won a very contentious fight a couple of years ago. So I would encourage you to send them a note. I know Newberg also hires a lot of our graduates who are now teaching for them. Some of them have been very open and public about the challenge that it is to be teaching at Newberg right now in this time. So if you have colleagues or friends or people who are there teaching who are now being personally impacted by the decisions of the board, send them an encouraging note too. Because one of the things I have learned when I've been in the hot seat is that oftentimes support is silent and we don't really know it. So it's important to vocalize and make the support known to the people who need it. So I would just encourage you to do that.
I think that's a great point, Gerardo. And we actually, when you gave Jane her contact information, we reached out to her last night or 2 days ago, maybe, to ask if she wanted to be a part of this call. And she was busy, but she is going to watch the recording because she was interested to see where the conversation went. And so I think that'll be cool for her to see this. And I also wanted to say, I love this conversation, but I have to get back to work. I had a time slot from 12 to 1. And so obviously the conversation can keep going on. And I'd love to watch the recording of what else is discussed. But thank you guys for having this conversation and contributing some great insight. So
thank you guys for leading it. And we can also, maybe we can close out with a thank you to Inez, Gerardo. I'll say before that, next week, we have Abby Thomas, you're on the call. We are celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. The Lula Club is leading the next WildX on Friday, the 15th. So we'll be back here at noon. We'll have information about that soon. Thanks, Abby. Anything else you want to add? Okay. All right, on 3, thank you, Inez. 1, 2, 3. Thank you,
Thank
Inez.
you,
Thank you, Inez.
Oh, not enough time to unmute. Ah,
Thanks, everyone.
thanks, everybody. Good job, guys. Great job. Thanks, everyone.